Adora's jaw tightened, her hands trembling where they gripped Rian's shoulders. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound came out, only a sharp and terrified intake of air. The conviction that usually defined her was completely gone, replaced by a pale, hollow doubt that chilled Rian deeper than the mountain wind. Hothen didn't bleed. The red-feathered shaft remained lodged deep in his chest, yet the fabric around the wound stayed bone-dry. He stepped forward, the movement impossibly smooth, almost detached from the icy ground beneath his boots. "Look at her, Rian," Hothen said, his voice dropping to a calm murmur that seemed to echo inside Rian's mind rather than the air around them. She hesitates because her heart knows what her eyes refuse to accept. Umbara does not create life from nothing. It only takes what already exists and reshapes it. He reached up, his long fingers casually brushing against the wood of the arrow sticking from his sternum. "I am the breath you remember in the halls of Nostrador. I am the shadow that followed you when you fled. Your grandfather's memories belong to you, my son, but your blood belongs to me." Hothen took another step, closing the distance until the point of the arrow almost touched the pommel of Rian's drawn blade. "Will you strike down the man who gave you life, simply because the world turned dark around him?" Rian felt the sword in his grip grow impossibly heavy. Adora pulled back slightly, her bowstring taut once more, but her eyes darted frantically between Rian and the figure before them, locked in the same agonizing uncertainty. "Adora, look at him!" Rian begged, his voice cracking beneath the suffocating pressure of the moment. He didn't break his gaze from Hothen, but his breath came in short, ragged gasps. "Look at him and tell me, is this my father, or is it another lie?" Adora's chest rose and fell in sharp, terrified motions. The blade mounted to her recurve bow stayed locked on Hothen's throat, her hands rigid, her stance unwavering. Yet her eyes glistened with a painful doubt. I can't be sure, Rian," she choked out, her voice barely audible over the distant, terrifying thud of the northern giants. "Umbara's corruptions run deeper than steel and flesh. I don't know if the man he was is still in there, or if he's just a hollow vessel breathing dark promises." She didn't lower her weapon. The sharp silver tip of her bow blade gleamed inches from Hothen's pale skin, ready to strike the moment he made a hostile move. Hothen merely tilted his head, a faint, sad smile touching his lips as he looked at the cold steel pointed at his neck. "She fears what she cannot understand, my son," Hothen said softly, stepping even closer, forcing the edge of Adora's blade to press lightly against his neck. He didn't flinch. He didn't bleed. "Ask your heart, Rian. Not her. You know your own blood." Rian's eyes dropped from the familiar face down to the shaft protruding from Hothen's chest. The crimson feathers, the dark wooden shaft, the notched nock. All of it seemed so real, so absolute. Hothen followed Rian's gaze, looking down at his own sternum with casual disinterest. "Ah," Hothen murmured, "you still cling to the rules of their physical world." The shaft of the arrow began to warp. The polished wood bubbled and sloughed away, dissolving into a stream of thick, tar-like shadow that dripped upward into the freezing air, vanishing into thin ice dust. Just like the phantom walls of the false Nostrador. Just like the illusion that had sought to entangle Rian's mind. The arrow simply ceased to be. Where the wound should have been, Hothen's tunic was whole. Not a single tear in the fabric, not a single drop of crimson. Adora gasped, taking a sharp half-step back, though her bow blade remained leveled straight at his neck. "You cannot kill what surrendered death long ago, my boy," Hothen whispered, his dark eyes snapping back to Rian with a terrifying clarity. "Now put down your sword." Thud! 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 The rhythmic, earth-shaking pounding from the creatures beyond the northern mists surged through the bedrock, no longer just a distant rumble, but a violent, shuddering pulse beneath their feet. Adora's gaze snapped down to the snow-dusted stone. Pebbles rattled in small, chaotic circles around her boots, and the ice beneath them groaned under the sheer weight of what was approaching. She cast a desperate glance toward the main line, seeing the Alliance's shield wall faltering, the towering silhouettes of the giants looming through the gray haze. "Rian," she breathed, horror bleeding into her tone as the realization sank in. The battle was turning catastrophic. Yet Hothen didn't turn. He didn't flinch at the ground-shaking booms, nor did he pay any mind to the chaos unfolding down the mountain slopes. His pale, sunken face remained entirely motionless, his hypnotic gaze locked relentlessly onto Rian's eyes. "The story does not wait, Rian," Hothen whispered, his voice cutting through the trembling ground like a cold blade. "The world you know is being trampled into dust. Give me your hand, or burn with the rest of their fading dream. What is your answer?" For a single agonizing moment, the timbre of Hothen's voice fractured. The words were his, but the resonance behind them grew impossibly vast, so unnaturally deep and layered that the air itself vibrated with a sickening, ancient weight. It was not merely a father speaking to a son, it was the hollow echo of something patient, endless and absolute, a voice that had watched empires crumble into dust and called it progress. It spoke as if Rian's entire life, his pain, and his defiance were nothing more than a momentary flicker in a darkness that had already won. The chill that swept through Rian had nothing to do with the freezing mountain wind. Aetheria gasped, her grip on her bow slipping a fraction of an inch as her instinct clawed at her to fall back. Even the air around Hothen seemed to warp, the light dimming as if bowing to the staggering ancient presence bleeding through his illusion. Hothen blinked slowly, the suffocating weight softening back into the familiar, haunting cadence of his father's voice, though the dark glint in his eyes remained. "You feel it, don't you?" Hothen whispered, taking one final, deliberate step closer. "The truth of what waits beyond your foolish war." The world around crashed back into existence. Down on the lower slopes, the massive creatures unleashed guttural, brassy roars that rattled the teeth in Rian's skull. The disciplined lines of Nostrudor were beginning to buckle. Panicked screams of men echoed up the mountain as soldiers abandoned their heavy shields, scattering over the frozen mud in a desperate attempt to flee the crushing boots of the giants. Beside them, the elven spearmen were shouting in high, melodious elven, their voices no longer serene but laced with frantic curses. They spat words of ancient warding and deep grief, calling down the wrath of the stars upon the horrors crawling out of the northern mist. Yet amidst the roaring, the screams, and the frantic elven curses, the small pocket of space between Rian, Aetheria, and Hothen remained eerily quiet. Hothen didn't flinch at the battle's roar. He stood unmoving in the center of the storm, his dark, ancient eyes holding Rian fast, waiting. "These abominations are yours, aren't they?" Aetheria's voice cut through the chaos, cold and laced with venom. Hothen didn't turn. He didn't blink. He didn't grant her even the smallest flicker of acknowledgement. But that deafening silence was all the confirmation she needed. The giant creatures tearing through the front lines were birthed from the same black pit as the inimicous horde standing before them. Something shifted inside Rian. The suffocating terror, the paralyzing doubt that had gripped his chest. It didn't vanish, but it twisted into a sharp, unyielding spike of nerve. He took a step forward, his boot grinding into the frozen gravel. "Who was Zarek?" Rian demanded, his voice rising above the distant roars of the northern giants. "Who was Garth? Who was Varric, and every single soul you forced into that cursed city?" Hothen's head tilted slightly, a slow, unnatural, bird-like jerk. A sickening ripple washed over his features, as if his face were made of water reflecting a ruined sky. The soft lines of Hothen's brow melted away. The dark eyes broadened, hardening into something brutal and familiar. The fine graying beard coarsened, thickening into a rough, scarred jawline. Before Rian and Aetheria's eyes, Hothen's visage was gone. A scar split across his left eye, and his mouth curled into a cruel smile. Rian knew this face. General Varric. Rian stumbled back a half-step, squeezing his eyes shut and furiously shaking his head, trying to bat the foul illusion out of his mind like a swarm of insects. But when he opened his eyes again, the nightmare remained. The face was real. The scar running across the left eye was real. "If only you had followed my orders, boy," Varric sneered, his voice a gravelly, rasping growl that sent a jolt of ice down Rian's spine. "You almost did," he continued. You were so eager to please me. Thwip! Adora's bowstring cracked like thunder. The arrow struck Varric squarely in the midsection with a sickening thump, the sheer kinetic force forcing the commander's heavy boots to drag back a pace through the frozen slush. Varric grunted, a low metallic sound, and looked down at the shaft buried in his stomach. As his eyes scanned the wound, the nightmare twisted again. Coarse, jet-black hair began to bleach and part, silver-gray locks cascading over his forehead. The jagged battle scar across his left eye smoothed out, absorbed into a deep web of sun-baked, weathered wrinkles. The rough jawline softened, and the short-trimmed beard blossomed outward, elongating into a thick, familiar tuft of iron gray. Varric's broad shoulders slouched into a slightly bent, burdened posture. Slowly, deliberately, the head snapped back up to lock eyes with Rian. The brutal commander was gone. Staring back at him now was the lined, ancient face of Zarek. "Always so quick to bleed your own, little bird," Zarek rasped. His voice lacked Varric's venom. Instead, it carried the hollow and melancholic weight of the old man who had guided Rian through the shifting halls of the false Nostrudor. Adora let out a sharp, ragged breath, her fingers instinctively reaching for another arrow, but her draw stalled mid-motion. The illusion wasn't just wearing skin. It was shifting through Rian's entire life, weaponizing every face he had ever trusted or feared. "Were any of them real?" Rian choked out, taking a defiant step toward the visage of Zarek, though his knuckle-whitening grip on his sword betrayed his inner turmoil. "Zarek, Varric, Garth, my father. Were they ever living men, or just puppet masks you carved out of shadow? Why do you think wearing their faces will change anything? Do you think I'm still the blind fool who marched through your false city?" "Rian, don't listen to him!" Adora's voice cut through from behind, rough and raw, but laced with a terrifying tremble. She kept her bow drawn, her knuckles white against the grip, but her eyes were fixed on the back of Rian's head with mounting dread. She had seen how Umbara preyed on the soul, how it didn't need to break a man with steel if it could simply erode his resolve, piece by agonizing piece. She could feel the subtle, dark tide pressing against them, waiting for just one moment of doubt, one crack in Rian's armor for the presence to slide back in and claim his mind forever. "He's bleeding your strength, Rian!" she cried out, her breath misting frantically in the freezing air. "He doesn't care about the answers. He's just breaking down your guard. Look away from his eyes." The figure wearing Zarek's face let out a soft, dry chuckle that sounded like dry leaves scraping over stone, paying no heed to the trembling arrow aimed at his chest. Adora drew another steel-tipped shaft from her quiver with a harsh metallic flick, jamming it into the groove of her bow blade. Her arms were shaking, but her eye was true. "No more lies," she spat through gritted teeth. She released. The bowstring snapped with a sharp twang. The arrow whistled past Rian's ear, so close he felt the freezing breeze of its flight bite his cheek, and streaked straight for Zarek's temple. It should have ended there. The distance was too short, the speed too absolute. But a blur of motion cut through the freezing air. With impossible speed, Zarek's hand shot upward. His fingers closed around the midpoint of the flying arrow with a deafening crack, stopping the steel tip an inch from his eye. The force of the catch sent a shock wave through the air, sending fine ice dust swirling around his arm. As his knuckles clamped tight around the wooden shaft, the old man's face rippled once more. The wrinkles smoothed away, the iron-gray beard retreated, and the weathered posture straightened into the tall, regal silhouette of Hothan. He held the trapped arrow casually between two fingers, his dark eyes unblinking. Instead of snapping the shaft, Hothan's head snapped toward Adora. His eyes flared with a cold and terrifying light. With a sudden jolt of his wrist, he whipped his arm forward. The caught arrow flew from his fingers at blinding speed. A blur of red feathers and dark wood cutting through the air faster than a bowstring could ever throw it. Thump! "Adora!" Rian screamed. Before either of them could even register the movement, the arrow planted itself deep into Adora's abdomen. The sheer force threw her backwards onto the ground, the heavy recurve bow clattering from her fingers as she hit the frozen battlefield. She gasped, a sharp, wet, desperate sound, and her hands immediately flew to her stomach, clutching at the dark wood protruding through her leather armor. Blood, bright and horribly real, began to seep through her fingers, staining the pristine white ice around her. Rian, snapping out of his trance, turned to her and dropped to his knees beside her, his sword falling forgotten into the slush. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird, his hands hovering frantically over her wound, terrified that touching her would only make it worse. "Adora, no, look at me," he stammered, his voice breaking into a ragged sob. "I'll be okay, Rian. Don't worry," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper against the howling mountain wind. Above them, Hawthorne slowly lowered his arm. He didn't rush forward. He stood over them, towering against the backdrop of the northern mists and the distant, thunderous roars of the giants, his face impassive as he watched Rian's world shatter in real time. "A noble effort," Hawthorne murmured, his voice sounding entirely too close, vibrating right at the edge of Rian's mind. "She bleeds for you, Rian. She suffers for your defiance. How much more of her life will you spend before you realize the outcome was decided long before you stepped onto this mountain?" "Now," Hawthorne murmured, his voice carrying over the whistling mountain wind. "Are you ready to listen, my son?" Down in the red-stained slush of the valley, the horror had evolved into a bloody, chaotic grind. The Alliance had found its teeth. Through desperate coordination, the front lines had brought down 2 of the northern beasts. A brave contingent of Nostrudor cavalry had charged recklessly low, their heavy lances snapping like dry reeds against the thick, leather-like hides of the giants' ankles, just enough to tilt their towering weight. The moment the hulking brutes hit the earth with a ground-shaking crash, a squad of elven spearmen swarmed over their massive shoulders, driving gleaming silver tips through the brutes' tough, bone-plated skulls. But the victory was swallowed by the tide. The Inimicus had finally breached the broken shield wall. The battle had devolved into a brutal, lineless melee, iron clashing against dark steel as Nostrudor swordsmen fought blade to blade among the staggering boots of the remaining giants. Tormund, his visor caked in mud and dark blood, spurred his warhorse through the fray, tearing past a knot of shouting men to reach a tall elven captain. The captain was bracing his boot against the ribs of a fallen Inimicus soldier, wrenching his long, crimson-slicked spear free with a sharp grunt. "Captain!" Tormund bellowed over the deafening roars of the beasts and the scream of steel. He reined in his breathy charger, leaning low from his saddle. "Take your fastest runners and break for the mountain paths. Order a full evacuation of the rear encampments and lower passes. Now!" The elf captain wiped a smear of black blood from his high cheekbone, his piercing eyes narrowing as he glared at the human commander. "Abandon the field?" the captain demanded, his voice an icy blade of pride and fury amidst the storm. "The Dryads have yielded enough earth to darkness. If we break formation now, the lower flank collapses, and those monsters will march over the bodies of your infantry before the sun reaches its peak." "If this line collapses entirely, there won't be anyone left to evacuate," Tormund yelled back, pointing his notched broadsword toward the looming shadows still pouring out of the northern mists. "Save who you can, elven captain. I will hold this mud for as long as I have breath, but I need a path left open for the survivors." The elven captain took a long, heavy second to scan the carnage. His gaze locked onto one of the colossal beasts, sweeping a massive, iron-spiked club through the ranks, crushing a dozen Nostrudor men into the mud. He clenched his jaw so hard the muscles in his cheek twitched. "Very well," the captain rasped, the ancient pride yielding to dark necessity. He wheeled around toward the slopes, lifting his crimson-stained spear high into the freezing air. A melodic shout burst from his throat, a series of high, piercing, elvish commands that echoed over the din of battle. The call rippled down the line, and the rear guards began a disciplined, swift retreat toward the mountain trails. Then, the mountain erupted. A brilliant, blinding flash of azure light tore through the gray gloom above, painting the snow-capped crags in vivid, electric blue. The retreating soldiers froze in their tracks. Tormund's warhorse reared back with a panicked whinny, but the general quickly reined the beast in, swiveling his mount toward the source of the brilliance. Through the swirling ice dust and the parting ranks of elven archers, a solitary figure emerged from the light, stepping calmly onto the battlefield. It was Hokar. The elder moved with an impossible and steady grace, his long robes sweeping over the blood-stained slush. In his hand, His ancient wooden staff hummed with power, the large, raw gem at its crown radiating a blinding pulse of blue light that cut clean through the darkness. Tormund spurred his horse into a hard gallop, pulling up a few paces from the old man and kicking up a cloud of frozen mud. "Hokar, what in the high heavens are you doing here?" Tormund roared over the battle, his voice raw. "You belong in the upper sanctuary. You were meant to be protected." Hokar didn't look at the general. His pale, luminous eyes remained fixed on the shadowed battleground ahead, where the dark presence of Umbara clung to the crags like a shroud. "My body is old, Tormund, but my sight is clear," Hokar said quietly, his soft voice effortlessly carrying over the roars of the giant beasts. "A sanctuary is only as strong as the mind that guards it. Stone has never protected a people, Tormund, and my grandson's spirit is fracturing." He tightened his grip on his staff, the blue gem flaring white-hot. "He needs me, now." It was a silence deeper than the war. As Hokar moved, the freezing wind seemed to die around him. The chaotic roar of steel on steel, the guttural bellows of the northern giants, the frantic shouts of the dying, all of it dulled into a distant, muffled hum, as though even the mountain had forgotten how to breathe. A battle-hardened Nostrudor veteran, his shield split in two and his arm dripping blood, stepped backwards into the slush, his eyes wide as he lowered his sword. A pale dryad, her wooden armor splintered and her bowstring snapped, shrank back against a jagged crag, her glowing eyes tracking the old man's steady stride with a mixture of awe and something far older than fear. Even the panicking war horses, blind with terror from the scent of blood, ceased their wild thrashing. They lowered their heads, stepping softly to the side as the air around Hokar rippled with a clean and ancient resonance that cut straight through the dark, suffocating fog of Umbara. Hokar did not look left or right. He did not quicken his pace, nor did he slow down. The glowing gem atop his staff cast long, dancing blue shadows across the mud-slicked faces of the Alliance. With every step he took toward the battlefield, the unnatural frost clinging to the rocks seemed to thaw, leaving a thin trail of clear, uncorrupted earth in his wake. He was a lone beacon pushing into the heart of the storm. And as the survivors parted to let him pass, no one called after him. No one dared. Tormund watched the old man pass, his breath hitching in his throat. His gaze remained locked on the stone crowning Hokar's staff. It was no ordinary conduit. The radiance bleeding from it wasn't the flickering heat of a spark or the cold sheen of polished glass. It was an inner, liquid brilliance that pulsed from the very heart of the gem, as if a dying star had been trapped in crystal before the world had a name. It cast long, deep blue light across the blood-soaked snow, driving back not just the darkness, but the unnatural chill that had weighed on every soldier's ribs. A strange, heavy reverence washed over the battle-hardened general. For all his years in armor, for all the steel he had seen broken and all the blood he had spilt, he had never felt a power like this, ancient, primordial, and utterly unyielding. Tormund let out a long, ragged exhale, the steam curling into the frozen air. As he watched Hokar walk on alone, a solitary figure against the swirling shadows of Umbara, a quiet and fierce relief settled in the general's chest. Standing amidst the gore and the howling mountain wind, Tormund felt a sudden, sharp memory cut through the fog of war. He was a boy again, tucked under heavy wool blankets in the high timber halls of Nostrudor, listening to his grandmother's voice rasp against the crackle of the hearth fire. She had spoken of the old world, of Aethelgard, the realm before the Shatter, where the ancient elven folk did not rely on steel or wall to guard their borders. She had told him tales of two stones carved from the bedrock of the world's first sunrise. Legend said these gems held no heat, yet possessed a light so pure, so primordial, that no shadow, no foul or lingering spirit could stand in their presence without being laid bare. For 30 years on the battlefield, Tormund had dismissed it as a nursemaid's comfort, a sweet children's fable meant to keep the northern dark from creeping into a young boy's dreams. But as he stared at the brilliant, pulsing sapphire core of Hokar's staff, watching the black frost melt from the stone and the oppressive weight lift from his own lungs, the breath caught in his throat. It wasn't folklore, it wasn't a fairy tale. It was real, and one of those ancient wardens was marching directly into the heart of the storm. In Tormund's mind, the roar of the valley seemed to fade entirely, swallowed by the crackle of a long-dead hearth fire. He could still smell the sweet smoke. He could still feel the heavy wool blankets pulled up to his chin, and clearest of all, he heard her voice, soft and weighted with a terrifying certainty. "Child," his grandmother whispered, her phantom eyes staring past him into the embers, "pray you never live to see the breaking of another." Tormund's eyes snapped back to the present, focusing on the blinding blue aura carving its way up the mountain path. The breaking of another. He looked from the staff up to the dark, swirling tempest choking the battlefield, where Hothan waited, where Rian and Adora must have been, where Umbara's ancient shadow reached out to claim its prize. If Hokar's gem was one of the legendary twin stones of Eithilgard, then where was the second? And what terror had been unleashed upon the world when the first one had broken? A cold dread, far sharper than the biting mountain wind, settled deep into Tormund's bones as he watched the old man disappear into the mist.